Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another debate organized by the Warsaw Institute. Today we are touching a very important topic in terms of international relations. Today we'll discuss the internal situation in Georgia and the recent developments related to this country. My pleasure to introduce my today's guests, Mr. Georgi Badridze, Senior Fellow, Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Relations. Good evening. And Mr.
Good
Sviat
evening.
Adzibaya, co-founder and managing partner at LIDEX. Good evening.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining today, gentlemen. Let's move directly to questions of our debate. First of all, I would like to ask you about the internal situation in Georgia. I'd like to ask you about the development, about anti-corruption efforts, and creating stability in Georgia. What is your opinion on how should the government address the biggest issues that Georgia is facing now, and what are the biggest challenges that Georgia is facing currently, and what are the perspectives standing in front of Georgia? We'll start with Ambassador Badridze. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Dvorski. With your permission, I would slightly modify the question I'm answering because Georgia at the moment in an extraordinary situation, a situation when the legitimate government is in question, certainly by the entire opposition, by the president, and also by Georgia's most international partners. And the question of legitimacy arises first and foremost from the recent election, which absolute majority of the observers, the entirety of the opposition, and very large part of the Georgian society believes was rigged beyond recognition. Georgia rarely had a model election. Irregularities were present at most elections we've had since independence, but rarely the outcome of the election was so much and so dramatically impacted by the deliberate and systematic rigging of the election by the government. So this time around, opposition refuses to recognize the outcome. The same applies to the president. She basically now joined the opposition in condemning the election, and therefore she also questions the legitimacy of the current government. And Georgia's main international partners, from most of them, is at least the European countries, Northern America, and most democratic countries so far have not recognized the outcome of this election, in which the government has claimed a victory by 50.9% vote. So this is the most burning issue at the moment. The opposition demands fresh and independently managed, internationally managed election, and we are now having massive protest rallies, but also actions by which people are blocking the streets, the crossroads in Tbilisi. Most part of the central Tbilisi currently is basically is blocked. And as for the issue of corruption, this issue is really secondary. Although we really have a deep and systemic corruption. Some describe it as elite corruption, but I think this is just a byproduct of the type of the government we have. And this is where I will finish my initial remarks. What to see the big picture, I think we need to understand that what happened in the last 12 years in Georgia is called the state capture by an oligarch who came to power promising more democracy, more rapid engagement with the European Union and NATO, and with eventual membership in these two organizations. And instead, he managed to build a power vertical that is similar or almost identical to that of Russia. And there are many other elements that actually very closely resemble the Russian model. That would be the Russian style law on foreign agents, on LGBT, and others. So at the moment, we are basically observing this process in which Georgian democracy is at stake. Georgia's foreign policy, Georgia's westward orientation is at stake, which is being basically stolen by a Russian oligarch.
Connection. I hope we can hear each other and see each other. I heard the last sentences by Ambassador Badridze. I will just sum up the response to the questions. Once again, sorry for technical difficulties. So we touched the topic of the question of legitimacy, the opposition refusing to legitimize the outcomes of the elections, and of course the current massive protests on the street of Georgia. Before I give the floor to Mr. Azinbaya, I highly recommend our viewers to ask questions to our experts. Now coming back to Mr. Azinbaya, I'd like to ask you about your perspective on Georgian elections. And of course, if you could give us some kind of transatlantic overview, how does the line Georgia-Washington looks like now? What are the perspectives after US elections for Georgia? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me and Ambassador Badridze here today together. Simply put, Washington, D.C. and Brussels are not happy the way Georgian elections went. Initially, and most importantly, Georgians are not happy. Georgians are not split on this, but the majority of Georgians are not happy. And even pre-election research, statistics, empirics, data, and sociology, and public opinion shows that Georgians are not happy the way the elections were conducted in the best case scenario. And everybody knows that these elections were expected to be a very important indicator to qualify Georgia for European Union accession talks. That said, I think with the stakes in mind, with the geopolitics in mind, with Georgia's current political and global state of affairs in mind, I think since independence is one of the most important elections Georgia has had. And the world expected not the lack of irregularities or not, the increased amount of responsibility from the government that hasn't done a lot of responsible things in previous years, but hoped for at least an okay election. This was not an okay election. By all measures, this was a deeply flawed, and I would argue a stolen election. We could talk about that later, why it was stolen. But large-scale indication is that it's not been recognized, and those people who have recognized it is the club of Russia and China, Iran, Venezuela, Viktor Orban, and others. It's an immediate demonstration that if those people are congratulating you in the first place, the country is in trouble. The country wants to be a democracy tomorrow. That's one. The other is that the government was counting on Washington being busy, right? America had elections here a couple of days ago. and there is now a transitional period. That said, the government expressed repeatedly that they would be able to somehow get a green light from the incoming Trump team, and see an America that would close eyes to their repeated and continuous and long time wrongdoings when it comes to treating Georgians, treating democratic actors, and also treating American partners and allies on the ground who have done everything good, but good and strategically supportive to the Georgian people in the past at least 3 decades. So those things actually, when it comes to potential support from Trump, no one knows who Trump will support. The first Trump administration still is 2 months away, and the way it's being shaped, there is no guarantee that Georgian Dream would receive any endorsement or legitimacy. And we should not forget that anyone who gives legitimacy to any elections is the people. And the people of Georgia have decided not to give a legitimacy to this election. So American partners and allies do not usually go against the people of Georgia. And that will be probably the source of their diplomacy towards the current state of affairs there. Second, currently, foreign policy debate here in Washington, D.C. is pretty much determined by 2 chambers of Congress. And the 2 chambers of Congress are likely to pass two legislative pieces in support of Georgia, probably merged into one. And that will not be favoring fabricated elections. That will not be rewarding large-scale corruption or money laundering or election fabrication schemes of cooperation with Russia. The government is suspected deeply, and there is evidence that they're helping Russians evade some of the Western sanctions on all sorts, but also semiconductors, which is a foreign policy and national security priority here in Washington, D.C. for any administration, actually, especially Trump administration. Also, the government has aligned with China, and any junior foreign policy strategists in the government or advising government should know that the U.S.-China clash on a lot of issues in geopolitics is not going to favor anyone aligning China, especially speaking of the Trump administration, which is a lot hawkish on the issue. So to sum it up, Georgia's friends and allies, most importantly, are not happy and are not enthusiastic about recognizing these elections. They're also, one must also say, why are they not saying abruptly to not, that these elections were illegitimate? My best guess here is they're careful. Elections is a source of democracy, and if elections is that important for the people of Georgia, as stipulated actually in the EU enlargement report and accession talk related discussions, then they're careful to not damage the reputation of the country long term, not because they like it or not because they agree with the fundamental flaws of the election, but also look ahead. This is a chance for the people of Georgia, through nonviolent means, to speak up and be heard. I think what Washington and Brussels are looking forward to seeing is the Georgian people make this statement. They made statements showing up at large numbers in polling stations across the globe and at home, but also seeing the continued strong and clear positions that these elections are not okay. And whatever the Georgian dream is trying to portray the Georgia as such, it's not reflective of Georgia as a nation and as one of the most European and pro-EU and pro-NATO and pro-American nations. So I think we'll see the rest of it as the weeks unfold.
Thank you very much. You said a lot about the elections, about that elections are the source of democracy, but you've also said that the election was stolen, and I would like to dig a little bit deeper with this statement. If you could just elaborate more and give us more overview about this sentence to our viewers so that they can better understand what really happened in Georgia. And I'm referring to Zviad Ajinbaya, and I'm leaving the floor to you as well.
I'll be very brief to allow Ambassador Badridze to comment his own, but there is no one. It's a broader political statement. The elections were stolen, and I back it up. I start backing up by giving the initial results of statistical analysis conducted by a highly reputable HarrisX a data analytics and market research company who conducted 12,000 interviews in Georgia in one day. And on top of the interview, some comprehensive analysis was done to find out some of the key areas where votes were really unusually distributed, and find out some of the key sources and areas and regions and districts and precincts of irregularities. What I have seen already, and I was advising HarrisX as an independent expert, do that analysis, and I'm proud of that project. Is that at least HarrisX found 172,000 votes that were allocated to benefit the government. HarrisX called those distribution of votes statistically improbable or impossible. These are statements that are not an initial junior project, but done by some of the best mathematicians and statisticians. This is not a political discussion. This is one indication. Where did those votes go? And then you have several local but internationally recognized civil society organizations. We're not even talking about political organizations, who showed thousands of facts, visual, video, audio evidence, accounts, reports of election day, pre-election, post-election irregularities that were there. And then you have also international organizations, none of which that these elections were free or fair. Combination of those factors, bring us to a point where significant number of votes were affected and impacted as a result of government-initiated, Russia-supported, locally executed, I would say, hybrid warfare and active measure efforts, that there is no other way but to call it a stolen election. You might expect someone like the Georgian Dream, trying to tailor election results by 1 or 2% margin. We're talking about 10+%. Boy, that's stealing.
Can I add some of the specific details? Number one charge is that the government basically violated the most sacred principle of the secrecy of the ballot. And it really matters in a country like Georgia, where, for instance, anyone who is in civil service or depends on social security aid, or in any way basically could fear for the consequences of their political choice, if that choice is revealed and if it is in favor of the opposition. Their choice, their vote was definitely neither secret. It wasn't secret for a very simple reason that this year the government came up with a new technology by which you would have to color a dot on a piece of paper and then feed it into a counting machine, which basically registers the ballot electronically. The problem was that the ink basically leaked through the paper, and you could see it from the other side. And how people were instructed to vote was to first color the dot, then to put this paper ballot into a folder, and the folder was shorter than the ballot, and then to reverse it and to feed it into the machine. While doing so, the observers, the cameras, could very clearly see where that dot was, even on the reversed paper. Even if you couldn't tell which party specifically did someone voted, it was quite obvious whether this dot was at the top or the bottom of the paper, thus distinguishing between the opposition and the government party. The government party was number 41. It was at the very bottom of the paper. And main opposition parties were 4, 5, and 9. right? So it was absolutely obvious for anyone present in the ballot room for whom the voter had voted. So this means that uh, in case of hundreds of thousands of people who were fearful of losing their jobs or losing their social security aid, etc., 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 they they felt compelled to vote for the government. Number one. Number two, Zviad already referred to statistical anomalies or impossibilities. One very simple fact is that you have average number of people, percentage of people turning up, turnover of the people. So you have average number of people voting in various places, and more depopulated the place is, higher the number of people that showed up for the election, including in places which have no population anymore, completely. So in cases, in places where you had less or no observers, the government received close to 90 and 100% of the votes. In many places, the government received more than 100% of the vote. More ballots were cast than the registered number of voters. And we have dozens of precincts with such anomalies, or rather impossibilities. Well, which means that in some places the government representatives were too rigorous in providing good results for their government, where they actually exceeded 100%. There are precincts in which 100% or more men voted, whereas average number of men was like drastically different, lower, voting in other districts. And also there were very clear cases of removal of the IDs from people, and that process started before the election. And government has clearly put up together a database of people who either had left Georgia or were obviously not intending to vote, and they cast vote for them. And this is called the carousel, or merry-go-round. They would bus people around several electoral precincts, and using other people's IDs, they would vote repeatedly. And we also have documented cases, this is on video, of very old-fashioned ballot stuffing, when people with bunch of ballots would put them into the ballot boxes. So this was a combination of all sorts of violations, all of which amount to vote stealing. So I would like to repeat that with this election, Mr. Ivanishvili, a Russian oligarch whom I always perceived as a Russian Trojan horse, basically had more or less concluded the process of state capture. He started with eroding of the state institutions. He extended his personal control over all three branches of power in Georgia. And this year, he basically launched the final assault on the one and only remaining area of freedom, area which he personally did not control, that is civil society, NGOs, and what remains of the independent media. And he passed this Russian law on foreign agents, and this was the final act. By stealing the election, he basically put himself beyond legitimacy, knowing full well that he would not be recognized, his government would not be recognized by Georgia's main partners. Now basically repeating Mr. Lukashenko's experience. The difference between Georgia and Belarus is that for the stability of illegitimate government, of a dictatorial government, one needs an economic base. In many cases, you have countries with natural resources, oil or gas, etc. In case of Belarus, you have very well-developed industrial base and a developed agricultural base. Georgia has neither. This is why I believe it would be much harder for Ivanishvili or whoever to actually preside over a stable dictatorship in Georgia. Even if we leave aside the attitude of the majority of Georgians, which are much less likely to reconcile with the loss of their generations-old dream of living in a European democracy. And this is literally the case. Generations of Georgians have been hoping, dreaming of rebuilding an independent Georgian state, of returning Georgia back into the family of European nations. This is what our ancestors did in 1918 when we first gained a chance of restoring Georgia's independence. This is what they did. The Georgian Democratic Republic was a staunchly European democracy, admired by many European politicians and leaders who have visited Georgia back in 1920. And this was the dream of my generation, who witnessed the rebirth of Georgia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the people who have been fighting first for the independence and then trying to build a European democratic political system. All of this is now being basically hijacked and stolen by a greedy, not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of power, by the ambitions and interests of a greedy Russian oligarch who is building not a Georgian dream, as he calls his party, but an oligarch's dream, a private little country. I really hope that he won't get away with this. And well, I live very close to the Tbilisi State University where I teach, and these streets were filled with people. They were blocked, and especially the youth, but also people of all generations, are determined to fight for Georgia's independence, for Georgia's European choice.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Very interesting point related to this new solution with coloring a dot and then putting it into ballot. This is definitely an interesting procedure when it comes to elections in the region. Both of you gentlemen touched the topic of European Union, and I want to elaborate more on that. We all know that Georgia has held EU candidate status since last December, but recent legislative actions, such as, for example, foreign agents law, have stalled this process. So I would like to ask your opinion. How do you see Georgian path towards EU membership? What can the current government do? And I will combine here a question from our viewer as well. Can Georgia join the EU without joining NATO first? I will give the floor to Mr. Zviat Ajinbaya.
Thank you very much, Maciej. When it comes to, I was in Tbilisi last December, and I remember, the celebratory mood. I wrote a piece for the Atlantic Council about that. I submitted a second piece to the Atlantic Council this morning about some of the solutions proposed, but to try to resolve the current political stalemate and the crisis in the country. Georgia had so many crises, smaller and bigger in recent years, that we almost, generation grew up in a crisis. So I hope we at some point, fast enough, soon enough, manage to get on a European train that is where that goes where Georgia belongs. When it comes to more practical discussions about the EU integration, it's a historic opening for Georgia. No one expected 3-4 years ago that this would be that fast. But thanks to our Ukrainian brothers, sisters, and families, and friends who have sacrificed so much for this, we should also thank the Georgians. Actually, we fought the war. We fought the war for this, and we continue to fight the hybrid war and war on the streets every day to demonstrate to ourselves, but to the rest of the world, that we're not just consumers of these ideals, but we're also investors, ideas investors, and investors in many fronts in what we call a common European family. That's two. And three, it's difficult to see or to say what the government can do when the government says they won't do. So it's kind of an illusion almost to talk about what government can do. Government could absolutely not adopt the foreign agents law. Everybody in the European Union, there was almost no country left, short of one or two fringe democracies that identifies as a Georgian friend or ally, who did not advocate against this law. There was hundreds of thousands of Tbilisi last spring of demonstrators last spring in Tbilisi who said, "Do not do this." There was the official European Union statement and series of statements at all levels to argue against such a law. And then specifically saying that this law would kill the prospect of the European Union membership and accession talks. When you have this on the table, and then when you have this law on the table, there's no need, there's no timing, there's no utility, there's only Russia being happy about the law. You're a self-selected harm of your nation and democracy. That's it. So that said, I don't think there's much that government can do other than just go home. And one thing they can do is really, because again, I'm not talking here with politically charged statements or overly emotional positions. I'm talking about what's logical and what we've seen. The chances that the Georgian people and the Georgian partners abroad have given to the Georgian government to drive the broader discussion. They've gone against the streams of normalcy, against the streams of Georgia's fate, and against the streams of any logic that guides those processes. That's it. So at this point, I think for Georgia's political path towards the EU to continue in the ways that Georgian people desire, that government change has to happen. And it's not guaranteed by only change, but anyone who changes Georgian government should be an amazing, fast-track, forward-looking, technocratic, technical, and highly competent group of people who will not only revive hope at home, but mend Georgia's broken relationships abroad. Because Ambassador Badridze and many of his colleagues have invested their sweat and blood in building and strengthening Georgia's reputation. It's not granted. It should not be taken for granted. But it's done and built in a world that does not guarantee friendship. Right. That's it. So I think that's that. And when it comes to NATO, we talked about NATO prospects being a lot closer before than European Union. It seems like European Union prospects are now a lot more tangible, even though European Union discussions should always be matched with NATO discussions, given the regional geopolitical conversations, especially when the Ukraine war is going to be debated and discussed in U.S. administrations and European capitals. Georgia should and belongs to that conversation table, which started actually with Georgia being at the center of the table.
Thank you very much. Let me just underline what you have mentioned at the beginning of your response. It is difficult to see what government can do when it will not do anything. And I'm passing the floor to Ambassador Badridze with the same question about European Union's future of Georgia. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would only add that for years this government successfully imitated the pro-Western policies. It did sign the association agreement and also DCFTA with the European Union, but did not act upon those two agreements. For instance, after signing the free trade deal with the European Union, it was Russia, not the European Union, which became number one trading partner for Georgia, or that Russia regained its position after years when Georgia had learned to live without Russian markets, to live without Russian energy. This government deliberately returned the leverage to Russia, economic and trade leverage, which Russia, we all know it has a very long track record, will always use for political purposes. So it was just 2022 when our partners in Brussels and other European capitals discovered that even opening of the European Union doors to Georgia was not only a stimulus for much more rigorous democratic reforms to Ivanishvili government, but actually it became the moment of truth when Ivanishvili was basically forced to show his cards. Yes, his government did apply for the membership, but in parallel, it was doing all exact opposite of what was expected out of the candidate country. So, and since then, we heard completely outlandish, crazy accusations on part of the Georgian government toward our closest allies, conspiracy theories such as the Global War Party, the European and American allies demanding opening of the second front against Russia, etc., etc., and of course this identity speculations that the European Union is trying to basically steal Georgianness out of our souls and turn us into something that we're not culturally and including sexually. So basically, the European Union must have seen that there is a direct conflict between the European standards and the interests of oligarchy. Oligarchy aspires to total control, and Ivanishvili has basically achieved this control to a very large degree. As I said, he has personal control over the government, over the legislature and judiciary in Georgia. And now his ambition has been extended beyond this into the realm of civil society and NGOs and media. And we are just entering this new chapter when he has created the mechanism of stifling, killing all those organizations. And we're just going to see how this goes. So basically, as long as Ivanishvili's government is in charge, there is absolutely no theoretical prospect of Georgia's progress on the European path. It is the job of the next government which will represent the will of the Georgian people, and this will has been expressed time and time again in various opinion polls, also in a plebiscite in 2008, and also it is fixed in the Georgian constitution. More than 80% of Georgians want Georgia to be part of the European Union. More than 70% of Georgians want Georgia to be part of NATO. And Georgian constitution says that Georgia's government is obliged, it must do everything in their power to deliver Georgia into the membership of the European Union and NATO. But like I said, it is the job of the next government that has legitimate power that represents the will of the Georgian people.
Thank you very much. So there is a strong will among citizens, but of course, when it comes to government and policymakers, we shouldn't expect any progress in the following time. As you've both mentioned, we need a new government to speak realistically about potential EU enlargement with Georgia. Gentlemen, that was the last point to touch today during the debate about Georgia's internal situation. from this point, I'd like to thank you very much for your participation and sharing your interesting insights with our viewers. Thank you very much once again. And dear viewers, I highly recommend to all of you our tomorrow's debate, where we will touch the topic of situation on Middle Eastern frontline and Ukrainian frontline as well. Mr. Azimbaya, Mr. Badridze, thank you very much once again, and I wish all of you a peaceful rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.